Hello, and welcome to our series on trauma and executive functions. Myself and Dr. Kate Payne will be teaching you how trauma impacts on executive functions, different types of executive functions, and how you can support children with executive functioning difficulties. Stay tuned. All of us, children, young people, and adults, we encounter circumstances of threat which might result in fear and anxiety. Under these circumstances, our brain's stress response is activated to help to keep us safe, and this can be what we call a fight response, a flight response, or a freeze response. Under normal circumstances, an individual or a child can regulate themselves and then actively plan and execute a well-considered response. On the other hand, for children that have been exposed to strong, frequent, and protracted adversities such as physical abuse, severe neglect, and exposure to domestic violence, these high levels of toxic stress produce what we call physiological changes, including recalibration of the brain's alarm systems and alteration in the system's ability to filter information from irrelevant to relevant information. In light of these circumstances, this results in changes in which a child might have too heightened an activation level, making the child either hypervigilant, or on the flip side, this can result in too low of an activation level, which is what we call hypervigilance. For children exposed to toxic stress, normal everyday events from them signal danger. Therefore, in terms of looking at our stress response, a child is not able to process, evaluate, and plan when they see a stimuli within the environment. Instead, that child can only observe, interpret, and go straight into acting. Now, when a child is developmentally stuck in their survival mode, very little information can get passed up to the brain's higher region. Let us think about the brainstem, limbic area, and the prefrontal cortex. When little information gets passed up to higher brain regions, this can result in limited abilities as it relates to cognitive functions. Exposure to adversities can lead to deficits in what we call executive functions, and children need these to assist them in terms of solving complicated problems, making decisions, and adjust those decisions when necessary. Children also need executive functions to recognize and correct their mistakes, as well as control their impulsive behavior. Another important thing to note is, as it relates to executive functions, it is that children also need these skills to be able to set relevant goals and monitor progress towards meeting those goals. So how can we support children with executive functions, and what are executive functions?
Thank you, Sasha, for that introduction. So I am Kate Payne, an educational psychologist at Cognos Educational Psychology Service. And now I'm going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about executive functions. As Sasha explained, executive functions are involved in the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex, which is the top part of the brain. It can be described as the conductor of the brain's orchestra, so the person organising and leading the group, or perhaps an air traffic control system managing the departures and the arrivals at the same time. It's the regulation of the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviours, an interactive cognitive process to help you carry out and execute a task. If you're thinking about perhaps an evening at home, you're making a dinner whilst you're helping your child with your homework. You're making a plan for your work the next day. You might take a note of the phone number your neighbour gives you and write it down as soon as you find a pen. You might take a deep breath rather than honk your horn when someone pulls out on you in your car. In all of these instances, you are using your capacity to display self-control. You're monitoring your behaviour and you're following multiple step directions at one time. You're using your executive functions in your everyday life. You can recognise the limits of your executive functions, and you can use compensatory strategies such as perhaps writing a list. In every day, we are using these as adults, and the expectations we place on children often rely on their executive functions too. In the research, there are lots of different variations around what executive functions might be. And here we're going to be thinking about the 11 main executive functions that we often are referred to within the research. We have response inhibition, which is our impulsivity and our capacity to inhibit our responses. We have task initiation, which is to be able to start a task, to plan and to prioritise. There is metacognition, and this is about thinking, being aware of what's going on as we complete a task. There's working memory. This is the capacity to hold in mind information whilst carrying out multiple steps. There's flexibility. This is being able to adapt and to be creative and to change as we're completing a task. Organisation of what we're doing. Emotional control, to be able to regulate and manage how we are feeling, and sustained attention. There is time management, there is goal-directed persistence, which is to be able to make a goal and persist to be able to carry out that task. In subsequent videos, we're going to be talking in much more detail about each of these different executive functions. But here is sort of an overview of the types of things that you might be using as you're using your executive functions. It may be helpful to think about how many of these skills we use in our everyday life and how often we expect children to demonstrate these skills too. We are not born with executive functions, we're born with the capacity to develop them or not, depending on our experiences in childhood. Our earlier experiences leave a signature on our blueprint, and this influences our genetic potential to be expressed in the brain circuits which underlie our executive functions. These skills are developed through practice and strengthened by our experiences. However, as Sasha mentioned a moment ago, adverse environments resulting from perhaps neglect, abuse, exposure to violence perhaps, can impair the development of our executive functions as a result of the effects of the stress on our brain development. We've all experienced a time when we've been exposed to threat, and we may have reacted through a fight or flight response. In these circumstances, we've had to calm down before we can use our executive functions. This is why, for example, we're told never to send an email in the heat of the moment. When our emotions are significantly heightened, we're not able to access the parts of our brain involved in thinking and problem solving. For some children, prolonged stress associated with living in a highly threatening, chaotic environment can make it difficult for them to engage with their executive functions, even in situations perhaps like school where they actually feel safe. Therefore, some children may be spending much of their school day in a heightened emotional state, acting in a primitive state of survival, where they're not having access to their executive functions and all the skills that are involved with that. Why is it important that we have executive functions? Well, executive functions can impact on relationships, on mental health, physical health, our professional success, antisocial behaviour, school readiness, lots of different areas. There's been lots of research to look at the relationship between executive functions and academic achievements. And there's been some research to find that executive functions in the early years have a better predictor of academic achievement than perhaps even IQ score. Therefore, executive functions can have a huge impact on a young person when they're in school, but also in their everyday life too. And that can carry with them into adulthood as well. It's really important, therefore, that we can support young people in this area and prepare them for adulthood. How can we support young people with executive functions? Well, brains are adaptable and they're flexible. They have neuroplasticity, which means that our brains can change and grow. And whilst this can leave young people vulnerable to executive function difficulties if they're not given the right environment, it can, on the other hand, also mean that a positive and enriching environment can actually have the opposite effect. The research states that young people should know how to use executive functions, have time to practice strategies, receive prompts to use them, and then reflect on their effectiveness. This can be achieved through developing their metacognitive awareness of executive functions. This is the introductory video as part of a wider trauma and executive function series. Please watch the 5 other videos in this series looking at the different executive functions, what they are, how they impact on us, and most importantly, how we can teach young people to have compensatory strategies to be able to support them in their everyday life as they grow through to adulthood. Thank you.